I'm Emma, by the way. You know how sometimes you feel like everything is going exactly as it should? Like life has handed you this shiny little package all tied up with a bow? That's where I was 2 weeks ago, floating on cloud nine, sipping mimosas at bridal fittings, scrolling through Pinterest boards for rustic elegance wedding themes, and daydreaming about my happily ever after. Yeah, well, apparently karma had other plans. The morning of our wedding shower started off perfectly. Normal. Too perfect if you ask me now. Sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains in my apartment, painting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. My best friend Liv, short for Olivia, but she'd kill anyone who called her that, was bustling around my kitchen making coffee while humming some random tune under her breath. She always hums when she's nervous, which made me smile because she wasn't even the one getting married. Liv, I teased, leaning against the counter in my oversized sweater and pajama pants. You're acting like we're planning D-Day instead of brunch. She shot me a look over her shoulder, flipping her dark curls out of her face. Excuse me, Miss Bridezilla in training, but someone needs to keep their head screwed on straight here. Do you realize your mom RSVP'd for 50 people without telling us? 50, and half of them are probably second cousins you haven't seen since middle school. I laughed, shaking my head. That sounds about right. Mom loves a good crowd. Besides, isn't it better to have too many people celebrating than not enough? Liv raised an eyebrow, sliding a steaming mug toward me. Easy for you to say. You don't have to deal with seating charts or dietary restrictions. We both laughed then, and for a moment everything felt so ordinary, safe. But deep down there was this tiny flicker of unease nagging at the edges of my brain. It wasn't anything concrete, just a weird vibe I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the fact that my fiancé Henry had been acting kind of distant lately. Or maybe it was the way Liv kept glancing at her phone like she was waiting for something bad to happen. Either way, I brushed it off. Weddings are stressful after all. People get weird, right? By noon, we were standing in the garden behind my parents' house, surrounded by white tents, string lights, and tables groaning under the weight of finger sandwiches and pastel macarons. It was picture perfect, the kind of thing you'd see plastered across Instagram feeds. Everyone looked happy, smiling and chatting like they'd known each other forever. Even Henry seemed relaxed, leaning casually against a pillar with his hands shoved into the pockets of his navy blazer. He caught my eye and gave me that crooked grin I fell in love with 3 years ago. For a second, I forgot all about my earlier doubts. But then came the speeches. My dad went first, of course. He's the sentimental type, prone to tearing up during Hallmark commercials, so no one was surprised when his voice cracked halfway through his toast. Emma, he said, raising his glass, you've always been my little girl, but today, seeing you here with Henry, I can't help but think you're ready to take on the world together. Cue the collective awe from the crowd. I felt my cheeks flush as I squeezed Henry's hand under the table. Then it was Henry's turn. This was supposed to be the part where he charmed everyone with his wit and charm, maybe threw in a funny story about our first date or how hopeless he'd been before meeting me. Instead, silence stretched awkwardly as he cleared his throat and adjusted the knot of his tie. Something about the way he hesitated sent a chill crawling up my spine. So, he began, his tone oddly formal, I guess I should start by saying, thanks for coming out today. I know weddings and wedding showers are a big deal. A lot of work goes into them, and honestly, he paused again, glancing briefly at me before looking away. Honestly, I never really thought I'd be here. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What did he mean? He never thought he'd be here? Wasn't proposing to me proof enough that he wanted this? My heart thudded painfully in my chest as murmurs rippled through the audience. Henry must have noticed the tension because he forced a laugh, running a hand through his sandy blonde hair. Let me rephrase that. What I mean is, I didn't plan on getting married anytime soon. Not because I didn't want to. I just figured I'd wait until I found the one. His gaze flickered back to me, and for the first time, I saw something unsettling in his expression. Regret? Guilt? Whatever it was, it sent another wave of nausea crashing over me. And then Emma came. Along, he continued, his voice lighter now, almost dismissive. She's amazing, obviously. Smart, beautiful, funny, all the things you look for in a partner. But let's be real. Timing is everything. Sometimes you settle for what's in front of you because it's convenient, because it feels safe. Settle. The word echoed in my ears loud and sharp, slicing through the polite applause that followed his speech. Settle. As in, I wasn't his first choice. As in, I was a backup plan. I barely registered the rest of the afternoon. Plates clinked, laughter bubbled up around me, but none of it reached me. All I could focus on was the dull ache spreading through my chest, the way my hands trembled as I clutched my champagne flute. When Liv finally pulled me aside, her face pale and worried, I knew she'd heard it too. She whispered urgently, gripping my arm. What do you need right now? Do you want me to kick him out? Do you want me to— No, I interrupted, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside me. Not yet, just give me a minute to think. And so, standing there amidst the chaos of what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, I realized something terrifying. The man I loved, the man I'd promised to spend the rest of my life with, didn't see me the same way I saw him. And now I had to decide what to do about it. The rest of the wedding shower passed in a blur, like I was watching it all through a foggy window. People milled around me, offering awkward congratulations, and trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed one of the most humiliating moments of my life. My mom kept shooting me these worried glances, her lips pressed into a thin line that told me she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Dad, bless him, tried to lighten the mood by cracking jokes about his own disastrous proposal story, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. Henry, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious, or maybe he was just pretending to be. He laughed at all the right times, chatted with guests like nothing had happened, and even managed to charm Aunt Margaret into forgiving him for forgetting her name last Thanksgiving. Watching him from across the room made my stomach churn. How could he act so normal after what he'd said? Did he not realize how much damage those words had done? Liev stayed glued to my side, hovering like a protective hawk. Every time someone approached us, whether it was to offer condolences or ask if everything was okay, she stepped in front of me like a human shield. "Emma needs some air," she announced loudly when my cousin Sarah started prying. "We'll catch up later." Finally, we slipped away to the quiet solitude of the garden path winding behind the house. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds chirped lazily overhead, and somewhere, in the distance, a fountain trickled water into a stone basin. It should have been peaceful, serene even. But instead, every rustle of leaves felt like a reminder of the storm brewing inside me. "Okay," Liv said once we were far enough away from prying ears. She turned to face me, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Spill. What are you thinking?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What was I thinking? That I'd been played? That I'd wasted 3 years of my life on someone who saw me as a consolation prize? Or worse, that I'd let myself believe I was worthy of being anyone's first choice? I don't know, I admitted finally, sinking onto a nearby bench. My voice cracked halfway through, betraying the fragile state of my emotions. "I mean, did you hear what he said? Settle. Like I'm some kind of fallback option." Liv sat down beside me, her expression softening. "Yeah, I heard him. And trust me, Em, I want to rip his head off right now, but before we go, full-on bride wars. We need to figure out what's really going on here. Do you think he meant it? Or was it just, I don't know, nerves?" I shot her a look. "Nerves? Seriously? You think he got cold feet in the middle of a speech and decided to call me his backup plan because he forgot his lines?" "No," she conceded quickly. "But people say stupid things when they're under pressure. Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. Then why hasn't he said anything?" I snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why hasn't he apologized or explained himself or anything? If he didn't mean it, wouldn't he have realized how bad it sounded and fixed it by now?" Liv hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. "That's fair. But you can't make any decisions based on what happened today. Not yet. You need to talk to him. Find out where his head's at. Talk to him." The thought alone made my chest tighten. What would I even say? "Hey, Henry, mind clarifying whether you see me as your soulmate or just someone convenient?" Yeah, that conversation would go over real well. Still, Liv was right. As much as I wanted to march back inside, grab the microphone, and announce to everyone that the wedding was off, I couldn't do that without knowing the truth. Not when there was still a sliver of doubt nagging at me, a tiny, stubborn part of my brain that refused to give up on the idea that this was all some colossal misunderstanding. When the party finally wound down and the last guest left, I found Henry sitting alone on the porch steps, staring out at the sunset. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. In the golden light, he looked almost unbearably handsome, his profile sharp and angular, his shoulders relaxed. This was the man I'd fallen in love with, the man who'd promised me forever. And yet, seeing him now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I barely knew him at all. "You gonna stand there all night, or are you planning to join me?" he asked without turning around. His tone was casual, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that set my teeth on edge. I stepped forward slowly, lowering myself onto the step beside him. The wood creaked beneath my weight, and for a second neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. "So," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "About earlier," he sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I figured you'd want to talk about that." "Want to?" I echoed, incredulous. "Of course I want to. Do you have any idea how mortifying that was? Half the people there probably think I'm some desperate loser who trapped you into proposing." "Whoa, hold on." He turned to face me then, his brow furrowed. "No one thinks that. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You literally called me your backup plan in front of our entire families. How am I supposed to react to that?" "I didn't mean it like that," he insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "Look, I was nervous, okay? Public speaking isn't exactly my strong suit. Things came out wrong." "Things came out wrong?" I shot back, my anger boiling over. "That wasn't a slip of the tongue, Henry. That was a confession. You basically told everyone that you settled for me because you couldn't find anyone better." "That's not true," he protested, standing abruptly. "You're twisting my words, am I?" I countered, glaring up at him. "Then explain it to me. Tell me exactly what you meant." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at me like he was searching for the right thing to say. But when he finally spoke, his words hit me harder than any insult ever could. "I meant that I wasn't ready for this," he admitted quietly. "Not yet. I thought I had more time to figure things out. But then you came along and everything moved so fast. I care about you, Emma. A lot. But sometimes I wonder if we rushed into this too soon." His honesty knocked the wind out of me. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers he clearly didn't have. Another part, the broken, vulnerable part, just wanted to cry. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't lying. This wasn't some grand betrayal. It was uncertainty, fear, doubt, and maybe, just maybe, it was something I'd been ignoring for a while now, too. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, Henry's words echoed in my head like a broken record. I wasn't ready for this. Sometimes I wonder if we rushed into this too soon. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it. That hesitant tone, the flicker of regret in his eyes, like he was trying to soften the blow but couldn't quite hide the truth behind it. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, heavy and unshakable. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside my window. Liv had insisted on staying over after the wedding shower, crashing on my couch, with a blanket and an oversized t-shirt she'd borrowed from my drawer. She was probably still asleep, snoring lightly like she always did when she was dead tired. But even if she'd been awake, I wouldn't have known what to say to her. How do you explain that the person you love, the person who's supposed to be your partner through everything, has doubts about the future you've built together? Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed and padded barefoot to the kitchen. Coffee seemed like the only thing that might make sense of the chaos swirling in my mind. As the machine sputtered to life, filling the room with its comforting gurgle, I leaned against the counter and let my thoughts wander. Was Henry right? Had we rushed into things? When I thought back to how quickly everything had happened, the whirlwind romance, the proposal 6 months later, it felt surreal, almost like it had happened to someone else. At the time, it had all seemed so perfect, so inevitable. We were young, in love, swept up in the excitement of building a life together. But now, standing here alone in my quiet apartment, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ignored the warning. Signs. Maybe I'd been so desperate to believe in happily ever after that I hadn't stopped to ask if Henry wanted the same thing. "Morning." Liv's voice startled me out of my reverie. She shuffled into the kitchen wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair sticking up in every direction. "You look like hell." "Thanks," I muttered dryly, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Exactly what I needed to hear," she smirked, grabbing a mug from the cupboard. "Well, you asked for honesty, didn't you?" I sighed, sinking onto one of the stools at the breakfast bar. I don't know what to do, Liv. Everything feels so messy." Liv sat down across from me, cradling her coffee like it was a lifeline. "Do you still love him?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I do," I replied automatically. But then I hesitated, picking at the chipped edge of my mug. "At least I think I do." "I mean, how can you love someone who makes you feel like you're not enough?" "That's not what he said, though," Liv pointed out gently. "He said he wasn't ready. That's different." "But why does he get to decide?" I burst out, frustration bubbling to the surface again. "Why am I the one left questioning everything while he gets to play the victim? He's the one who proposed, remember? If he wasn't sure, why didn't he say something before dragging me halfway down the aisle?" Liv didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of her coffee, her brow furrowed in thought. Finally, she set her mug down and looked me straight in the eye. "Because people are complicated, Em. Sometimes they don't know what they want until it's staring them in the face. And sometimes they convince themselves they're ready because they don't want to lose something or someone they care about." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that what had happened? Had Henry convinced himself to propose because he didn't want to risk losing me? The idea made me feel hollow, like I'd been living in a dream world where none of it was real. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing outside Henry's apartment building, clutching a paper bag filled with leftover pastries from the wedding shower. It was stupid, really. A feeble attempt to appear casual when my heart was hammering in my chest. I told myself I just wanted to talk, to clear the air. But deep down, I knew I was looking for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. When he opened the door, his face lit up with surprise. "Emma, what are you doing here?" "I brought you some food," I said lamely, holding out the bag. "Figured you might be hungry." He smiled faintly, stepping aside to let me in. His place smelled like stale coffee and cologne, the faint scent of laundry detergent lingering in the air. It was neat, as always. Books stacked neatly on shelves, shoes lined up by the door, but there was an emptiness to it that made my chest ache. This was the home we'd planned to share someday. Or at least, that's what I'd thought. We ended up sitting on opposite ends of his couch, the pastry bag forgotten on the coffee table between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched taut, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. "You didn't deserve that," Henry said finally, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "What I said at the shower, it was cruel, and I'm sorry." I nodded stiffly, wrapping my arms around myself. "Thank you. But an apology doesn't change what happened." "I know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I screwed up, Em. Big time. I never meant to hurt you, I just panicked. Seeing everyone there, hearing your dad talk about how much faith he has in us, it hit me how much pressure there is to get this right. To be sure. And are you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sure, I mean. Henry hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he confessed quietly. I care about you more than anything. You're smart, funny, beautiful, all the things I could ever want in a partner. But marriage is huge, scary, and I guess I've been wondering if I'm ready for that kind of commitment. His honesty should have comforted me, but instead it left me feeling raw, exposed. Because as much as I wanted to believe him, as much as I wanted to forgive him, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind. What if he was just saying these things to spare my feelings? What if he'd already decided that I wasn't the one, and he just didn't have the courage to tell me? I need time, I said suddenly, surprising even myself. My voice wavered, but I forced myself to keep going. To think, to figure out what I want to. Henry looked at me sharply, his expression unreadable. Are you breaking up with me? No, I replied quickly, shaking my head. Not yet. But I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. Not if we're going to fix this. For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw working as if he wanted to argue. Then slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said softly. Take all the time you need. As I stood to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over me. Part of me was terrified of what came next. The uncertainty, the loneliness, the possibility of losing him for good. But another part, the stronger part, knew I couldn't move forward without facing the truth, even if it broke me in the process. The days that followed were strange, quiet, lonely even. I'd always hated silence. It felt like an intruder in my life, creeping into the cracks and making everything feel heavier than it should. But now, surrounded by it, I realized how much noise Henry had brought into my world. Not just his voice or his presence, but the constant hum of expectation, of shared plans and unspoken promises. Without him around, my apartment felt cavernous, empty in ways I hadn't anticipated. I threw myself into work to distract myself, burying my nose in spreadsheets and client calls until my brain felt numb. It wasn't exactly glamorous. I'm a project manager for a mid-sized marketing firm, but it gave me something concrete to focus on. Numbers didn't lie, deadlines didn't waver, and no one cared if you cried in the supply closet as long as the campaign launched on time. For once, I appreciated the predictability of it all. Liv checked in daily, texting me memes and sending voice notes full of unsolicited advice. You're allowed to be sad, Em, but don't let him rent space. In your head, rent-free. She also showed up at my door one evening with pizza and a bottle of wine, demanding we have a proper pity party. We ended up binge-watching rom-coms and critiquing every unrealistic relationship trope, which somehow made me feel better, or at least less alone. But despite their best efforts, there were moments when the loneliness crept in anyway. Like when I opened the fridge and saw the leftover curry Henry had promised to finish before he left town last month, or when I accidentally scrolled past a photo of us on Instagram, smiling cheekily under twinkling string lights at some rooftop bar. Those little reminders stung more than they should have, catching me off guard and leaving me breathless. About a week after our conversation, Henry texted me. Just 3 words. Can we talk? My heart leapt into my throat before logic kicked in. Talk about what? Apologies? Regrets? Decisions neither of us was ready to make? Still, I couldn't ignore him. Not yet. So I agreed to meet him at a cafe near my office, a neutral place where neither of us could claim territory. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming cups of coffee in front of him. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually impeccable blazer was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. Seeing him like that made something ache deep in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Hey, I said, sliding into the seat across from him. You bought coffee? He nodded, pushing one of the cups toward me. Figured you'd need it. Thanks. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. So, what did you want to talk about? Henry hesitated, fiddling with the sleeve of his cup. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about needing time. And, I prompted, trying to keep my tone neutral. And I realized something, he continued, meeting my gaze for the first time. I've been so focused on whether I'm ready for this that I forgot to ask if you are. His words caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. You've always been the one chasing this dream of ours, planning the wedding, picking out venues, imagining what our future would look like. And me? I've just been along for the ride, nodding and going, along with whatever you wanted because it seemed easier than admitting I wasn't sure. That doesn't sound like not being sure, I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. That sounds like letting someone else take control. Maybe, he admitted. But isn't that part of the problem? I let you carry all the weight because I was too scared to face my own doubts. And now, seeing how hurt you are, I can't help but wonder if I've been selfish. If I've been using you as a crutch instead of stepping up and figuring out what I really want. The honesty in his voice took me aback. This wasn't the same man who'd stood on that garden stage, fumbling through awkward excuses and half-truths. This was someone raw, vulnerable, someone willing to admit they'd messed up. "Do you regret proposing?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Henry shook his head firmly. "No, not entirely. I meant it when I said I care about you, Emma, more than I've ever cared about anyone. But I think maybe I rushed into it for the wrong reasons. Maybe I thought love would be enough to fix everything. It's not," I murmured, staring down at my coffee. "Love doesn't erase fear or doubt. It doesn't magically solve problems. I know that now," he replied softly. "And I'm sorry for everything." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of his apology hanging between us. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to throw caution to the wind and believe that we could still salvage what we had. But another part, the smarter, more cautious part, knew it wasn't that simple. Trust takes years to build and seconds to shatter. Even if Henry truly regretted his actions, rebuilding what we'd lost would take time, effort, patience. "I need more than apologies," I told him finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "If we're going to move forward, if we're going to try again, you have to prove to me that you're serious, that you're ready to fight for this." "I will," he promised, his eyes locking onto mine, "whatever it takes." It wasn't enough to erase the pain or undo the damage, but for the first time since that disastrous wedding shower, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The weeks that followed were complicated. That's the only word I can think of to describe them. Every day felt like a balancing act, trying to figure out who we were now versus who we used to be, and whether those two versions could ever coexist. Henry kept his promise, showing up in small but meaningful ways. He sent thoughtful texts just to check in. He showed up at my apartment one weekend with groceries and insisted on cooking dinner, even though he burned the garlic bread and nearly set off the smoke alarm. It was sweet, in a clumsy sort of way, but sweetness doesn't fix everything. Not when there's still this invisible wall between us, a barrier made of unspoken fears and lingering doubts. For every moment where I felt hopeful, there was another where I wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable. Could love really conquer all? Or were we clinging to something that had already slipped through our fingers? One evening, about a month after our conversation at the cafe, Liv invited me over for what she called a girls' night. Translation: mandatory wine and brutally honest advice. She lived in a cozy studio apartment downtown, filled with mismatched furniture and plants that somehow always seemed to thrive despite her neglect. When I arrived, she greeted me with a hug and thrust a glass of red wine into my hand before ushering me to the couch. "So," she began, flopping down beside me, "how's Operation Save Your Relationship going?" I groaned, sinking deeper into the cushions. "It's not an operation, Liv." "Sure it is," she countered, raising an eyebrow. "You're either fixing it or letting it crash and burn. Which is it gonna be?" "I don't know," I exclaimed, exasperated. "That's the problem. Some days I feel like maybe we can work things out. Like maybe Henry's finally stepping up and being the partner I thought he was. But other days I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. If I'm holding on because I'm scared of starting over." Liv nodded thoughtfully, swirling her wine around in its glass. "And how does he make you feel most of the time? Happy? Secure? Or like you're walking on eggshells waiting for the next bomb to drop?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure. There were moments when Henry made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. Moments when his touch sent shivers down my spine and reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. But then there were the quieter moments, the ones where I caught him staring off into space, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. Moments where I wondered if he was thinking about someone else, or worse, about a life without me. "I don't think he's lying when he says he loves me," I admitted quietly. "But sometimes I wonder if loving someone is enough." Liv didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back against the couch, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she said, "Love is important, Em, but it's not the only thing. You deserve someone who chooses you, not because they're afraid of being alone, or because it's convenient, but because they can't imagine their life without you." "Does Henry do that? Choose you, I mean?" Her words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Did he? Did Henry choose me, fully and completely? Or was he still hedging his bets, keeping one foot out the door just in case things didn't work out? A few days later, I found myself standing outside Henry's building again. This time, I hadn't brought pastries or excuses. I'd come with questions. Big ones. The kind that couldn't be brushed aside with apologies or promises. When he opened the door, his face lit up with surprise, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "We need to talk," I said firmly, brushing past him into the apartment. My heart was racing, pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear myself think. Henry closed the door behind me, his brow furrowed. "Okay, what's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I echoed, turning to face him. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to keep going. "What's wrong is that I don't know where we stand anymore. You say you care about me, that you want to fight for us. But actions speak louder than words, Henry. And I need to know, are you fighting for me, or are you just scared of losing me?" He stared at me, stunned into silence. For a moment, I thought he might argue. might try to reassure me with the same platitudes he'd been using for weeks. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he admitted softly. "I've been scared. Scared of screwing this up, of making the wrong decision. But mostly, I've been scared of losing you. Because the truth is, Emma, I don't know what I'd do without you." His honesty should have comforted me, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. "That's not enough," I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "Being scared isn't choosing. It's just surviving." Henry stepped closer, reaching out to take my hands in his. "Then tell me what I need to do. Tell me how to prove to you that I'm all in." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to. But as I looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of certainty, all I saw was fear. Fear of commitment, fear of change, fear of the unknown. And in that moment, I realized something painful but true. I couldn't save us both. Not if one of us wasn't ready to jump. "I can't," I said finally, pulling my hands away. My voice broke on the last word, but I forced myself to finish. "I can't keep doing this, Henry. Not if you're not sure." He froze, his face pale. "Are you breaking up with me?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steadier now, because staying together would mean settling for both of us, and I refused to settle anymore. Walking away from Henry was the hardest thing I've ever done. It felt like leaving behind a piece of myself, like severing a limb I'd grown too attached to. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, something shifted inside me. A weight lifted, replaced by a fragile sense of freedom. Maybe I didn't have all the answers yet. Maybe I never would. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was choosing myself, and that more than anything gave me hope.